afternoon and welcome to all of you to this session of the conference entitled Defending Just War Theory, Three Views. I'm Father Mark Foreman, a member of the theology faculty here at Notre Dame and Vice President for Student Affairs, and I will be moderating this panel discussion. We'll hear from our three panelists and then they will take questions and comments. Our first panelist is Professor James Toner. James Toner holds the Ambassador Holland H. Coors Distinguished Chair of Character Development at the United States Air Force Academy. He is Professor of International Relations and Military Ethics at the U.S. Air War College, Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, where he teaches in the Leadership and Ethics Department, offering advanced courses in ethics, political philosophy, leadership, and character development. He is also taught here at the University of Notre Dame and at Auburn University. He is published in many journals and is the author of The Sword and the Cross, Reflections on Command and Conscience, and Morals Under the Gun, The Cardinal Virtues, Military Ethics, and American Society. Professor James Toner.
Thank you, Father. In 1945, as he traveled with victorious American forces as they penetrated deeper into a crushed Nazi Germany, journalist Arthur Hadley one day saw emaciated corpses fallen across barbed wire obstructions outside concentration camps. How barbarous it was, he thought, to treat the dead so. But then he saw these corpses stir, and he realized they were the living dead, treated by the Nazis in a manner so ghastly as to defy the most terrible nightmare. If and when they come to take you to the concentration camp, he wrote, fight them and fight them and fight them. If we joyfully believe as Jews and Christians that there is the law of love in which and to which the Scriptures testify, then we can sorrowfully but equally conclusively realize from the same inspired source that there is the fact of sin. And we will recognize that history is the stage upon which the actors of virtue and vice, joy and sorrow, and the sacred and the profane play out their roles, and will do so until the parousia. We err to presumption in quixotically expecting that all evil will turn to good, and we err to despair in lugubriously denying that any evil can be turned to good. In fact, one need only look at the conversion to Catholicism of the former abortionist Dr. Bernard Nathanson to understand that grace may abound. The final scriptural invocation is the prayer, Come, Lord Jesus, and the appeal that his grace might be with all of us. Unlike the first Christians or the later Millerites, we do not expect his imminent return. We're thus left to build his kingdom here as best we can as a fallen and sinful race called to the great commandment of love of God and neighbor with the limited power of our minds, the too selfish love of our hearts, and the weakened strength of our shoulders. We know that we are to give Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And we want to ask, O Lord my God, could you be more specific? As Catholics, we believe in sacred scripture and in sacred tradition, which is the doctrine, the life, and the worship of the church, and in the sacred teaching, the magisterium. We can easily marshal numerous scriptural quotations as proof texts, either of pacifism or of the just war concept. We turn, therefore, for faithful interpretation of scripture to the tradition and teaching of the church. No one canonized as a saint or named as a doctor of the church has ever defended pacifism as a social ethic. Moreover, many pious people, and one thinks of Aquinas, Augustine, Bernard, Bellarmine, and so many more, have defended just war. Scholars such as Tillich and Niebuhr and Chesterton and Monsignor Ronald Knox have viewed pacifism as Panglossian at best and as heretical at worst. The Holy Father has plainly said that we are not pacifists. And the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes is equally clear. And I'll quote here. As long as the danger of war persists, governments cannot be denied the right of lawful self-defense. State leaders have the duty to defend the interests of their people and to conduct such grave matters with a deep sense of responsibility. Soldiers should look upon themselves as custodians of the security and freedom of their fellow countrymen. And when they carry out their duty properly, they are contributing to the maintenance of peace. You can find that teaching reflected in the Catechism, by the way, at number 2310. Some years ago, I was invited to debate at a session of the Vermont Council on Humanities and Public Issues, at which the subject was whether war could ever be just. I have continually been struck by the irony that pacifists, good and kind and gentle people, can be so verbally bellicose. And on that day, they were particularly taken with the adjuration found in Acts 20:35, which says it's better to give than to receive. I was the beneficiary of their intense verbal gifts. I thought I had no allies in the rather large audience until an elderly man stood at the rear of the room and said, "I'd like to agree with this man," meaning me. "I am a musician, and I would like to tell you what is the sweetest music I have ever heard." Terrific, I thought to myself. There's one person in the entire room who agrees with me, and he's probably a nut. The gentleman went on to say that in 1945, he was a young Jewish boy in a concentration camp, the name of which I cannot now recall, but a Nazi concentration camp, and one day he heard the rumble in the distance of what proved to be U.S. Army tanks. Of all the symphonies he had subsequently heard, or in which he had subsequently played, he said, the sound of those tanks was the most beautiful, for it meant that he would grow to be a man. The audience had the decency to sit for a few minutes in graceful and respectful silence. I felt rather as Edward Everett must have felt at Gettysburg after Lincoln's terse but beautiful address. And those who hold that war can never be morally permissible, prudential, or strategically effective have never heard that gentleman's voice, nor perhaps even the plaintive cry of the Anawim, whose 1945 liberty and release were won by the Spirit of the Lord and by the instrument of U.S. Army tanks. When they come to take you to the concentration camps, fight and fight and fight. Whether you are Jew or Kurd, fight. Whether you are Russian being dragged to the Gulag or Cambodian being dragged to the killing fields, fight. Whether you are Kuwaiti in 1990 about to be slaughtered by Saddam or Chinese in 1955 about to be slaughtered by Mao, fight. To fight then and there is both duty and dignity. All questions of just war turn ultimately on one scriptural verse, Romans 3:8, which tells us that we may not do evil, that good might come of it. If we compare, say, Isaiah 2 and Micah 4, which would have us turn swords into plowshares, and Joel 3:10, which would have us turn plowshares into swords, we know that we must depend upon the apostolic church to govern, to sanctify, to teach, to interpret. The church has thus given us both the doctrine of double effect and the doctrine of just war, which historically tells us that our first presumption must be against injustice. The first presumption is not for peace against war, and you will not find such a presumption in Aquinas or Calvin, nor in that matter in Ambrose, Augustine, or Luther. And what would you do, I ask you, when you, as a modern Good Samaritan, come upon the battered man as the terrible beating is being done, and not after? Leviticus, I think, gives us the answer. Quote, "Nor shall you stand by idly when your neighbor's life is at stake. I am the Lord." It's 1916, if you care to read it. It's in the New American Bible. Courage and prudence are thus the sturdy twins of the parents first of justice, and second, of the presumption against injustice, and of the resulting duty we have to resist that injustice, and thereby to love both God and neighbor. And in the skies over Pennsylvania, when they come to hijack your plane, fight them, and fight them, and fight them. Because as Ecclesiastes tells us, there is a time for everything, a time of war and a time of peace. We employ both deontological or rule-based thinking about just war, for there are indeed both things we know and things we cannot not know, and prudential thinking. Indeed, the first three elements of the jus ad bellum, that's war decision logic, are deontological: just cause, right authority, and right intention. And these are against leaders' egotism. And the other four, proportionality of ends, last resort, reasonable hope of success, and the aim of peace, are prudential, against leaders' foolhardiness. We may say that the two elements of jus in bello, which is really war conduct logic, proportionality and discrimination, are both deontological and prudential. Because the just war tradition is in fact a method of moral reasoning, we need the political acumen of virtuous leaders, and we pray that our leaders, like Solomon, may turn to God and ask as he did, quote, for an understanding heart to distinguish right from wrong. The Catechism tells us the evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy in circumstances surrounding the question of the employment of military force belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. It's 2309. And again, I quote, legitimate defense can be not only a right but a grave duty for one who is responsible for the lives of others. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor be rendered unable to cause harm. If, for this reason, those who legitimately hold authority and also have the right to use arms to repel aggressors against the civil community, and they're entrusted to their responsibility. 2265. One last quotation from the Catechism. Public authorities have the right and duty to impose on citizens the obligations necessary for national defense. 2310. Now, these aren't the opinions of 3 or 4 people gathered at the end of Kelly's bar on some Wednesday night. They are the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, according to which I form my conscience. Now, any American, we recognize in gratitude, enjoys a civic freedom to challenge these teachings, as some at this conference may well do. In so doing, however, no one may responsibly portray the just war tradition as in any way inconsistent with the authoritative, the historical, the magisterial teaching of the faith which comes to us from the apostles. Just war teaching is thus necessary to moral thinking. That, however, is not to say that such teaching today is sufficient for it. Of course, we know that our allegiance to political rulers and their strategic judgment is always conditional, contextual, and contingent. The Church teaches us, of course, that there may be such a thing as remorseless violence and unjust war. But there's also such a thing as remorseless peace, a pitiless and heartless peace, a false peace. Jeremiah 8:15, we hoped for peace and a time of healing, but it was no use. Terror came instead. That may be why Peter baptizes a soldier without requiring him to renounce the bearing of arms, Acts 10, or why our Lord commends the faith of a soldier, Matthew 8, or even why at the crucifixion it is of all people a soldier from whose eyes the scales fall and he announces that truly this was the Son of God. Evil must be resisted by strong word and by strong deed. And so to temporize while tyrants engage in the barbarities of ethnic cleansing, for example, is not sanctified. It is sanctimonious and morally reprehensible. The United Methodist Council of Bishops published a pastoral letter this month on 9/11 in which first they Bowdlerized their final draft by eliminating a reference to 9/11-01 as a shattering evil. And second, they wrote, and I quote, violence in all its forms and expression is contrary to God's purpose for the world, end quote. This led columnist John Leo to write, and I'm quoting, this apparently means that both rapists and those who drive off rapists with baseball bats are acting in an unchristian manner. Ditto for terrorists and those who try to stop them, according to the Methodist bishops. Non-judgmentalism ends up putting perpetrators and their confronters on the same moral plane, end quote. The late Elizabeth Anscombe, really one of my heroes, was hardly one uncritically to accept government policy, but she emphatically believed that pacifism teaches us, quote, to make no distinction between the shedding of innocent blood and the shedding of any human blood, end quote. A culture of life must make that distinction. Catechism item number 2313 says, blind obedience does not suffice to excuse those who carry them, criminal orders, out. Thus, the extermination of a people, nation, or ethnic minority must be condemned as a mortal sin. One is morally bound to resist orders that command genocide, end quote. And by implication, to resist genocide itself. As only one example of this, consider the 1993 National Conference of Catholic Bishops' statement, the harvest of justice is sown in peace. Whereas the earlier statement, the challenge of peace, contained no major section on the use of armed force to promote justice, the subsequent letters specifically listed Haiti, Bosnia, Liberia, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, and Burundi. And later on they could have added certainly Rwanda to that list. The Catholic bishops are saying essentially that there are indeed times to drive off rapists with baseball bats. Indeed, the Holy Father has said that humanitarian intervention is, quote, obligatory where the survival of populations and entire ethnic groups is seriously compromised. This is a duty for nations and for the international community. In the face of genocide, the Pope has told us states, quote, no longer have the right to indifference. Military intervention is not only required strategically, it's required morally. Pacifism, whatever its form, can look upon savagery with little more than feckless and empty gesture. We return again and again not merely to rules, but to the auriga virtutum, the charioteer of the virtues, which is prudence. Athens and Jerusalem agree that although wise political judgment will never of itself be sufficient to guarantee equitable, ethical, and effective statecraft, such Aristotelian virtue, good and noble and decent leaders, are nevertheless indispensable. By way of conclusion, let me suggest that many years ago, when I first entered graduate school in Notre Dame's Department of Government and International Studies, it was a time when all graduate students here in political science were required immediately to take a course in Greek political theory. The woman who sat next to me during that semester-long course here was Condoleezza Rice. I am saying that Aristotle's understanding of ethics and politics as two sides of the same coin is fundamental to our topic this afternoon, and indeed will always be so. And I suspect that Dr. Rice would agree. Certainly as Catholic Christians, we must always work for peace, knowing, however, that in a world too often tragic and too often scarred by evil and by barbarism, requiring the defense of the innocent, whether they are developing children in the womb or developing peoples in the political world, whether they're murderers, be abortionist doctors, or absolutist dictators, we do work for peace, but we also work for justice. Indeed, in the year of 2002, we might still have with us today the great Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer to help us in our deliberations about the ethics of just or permissible war. But the U.S. Army tanks of 1945 were not swift enough, and the Nazis murdered Bonhoeffer in April of that year. But those same tanks and planes and soldiers did liberate thousands from fascist death camps. Justly, they fought for justice. In a world not merely of Hitlers, but also of Stalins and Mao Zedongs, and the Pol Pots and the Milosevic's and Saddams, there are times to fight, and to fight, and to fight. And the idea of the Christian soldier is thus not merely an honored ideal, but a compelling moral imperative, and will remain so until the prayer of Revelation, "Come, Lord Jesus," is again fulfilled, and we have His divine blessing and His eternal peace.
Our second speaker this afternoon is Professor Gilbert Mylander. Gilbert Mylander currently serves as the Board of Directors Chair in Christian Ethics at Valparaiso University. Before joining the faculty at Valparaiso in 1996, he taught at the University of Virginia and Oberlin College. He has served as an associate editor for the Journal of Religious Ethics, associate editor of Religious Studies Review. He's on the editorial board of the Annual of the Society of Religious Ethics, on the editorial board of Dialogue, and on the editorial advisory board of First Things. Professor Mylander has written extensively in the area of religious ethics, has a special interest in bioethics, and is a fellow of the Hastings Center. His most recent book is an edited volume entitled Working, Its Meaning and Its Limits, Notre Dame Press, 2000. Professor Mylander.
Thank you very much. Condoleezza Rice. I don't have any story like that. It is true that, and I'm always don't know if I should tell this story or not because it has a sort of embarrassing quality. Rather early in the Bush presidency, the Bush II presidency, don't ask me why, but I was reading in the paper the guest list for a state dinner that they had. I can't account for, I'm a little embarrassed to acknowledge that I was reading that guest list. And it was, and it would have who accompanied whom to the dinner. And Condoleezza Rice was accompanied by a Matthew Hennessy. And I would like to know, because many years ago I taught a young man named Matthew Hennessy at Oberlin College. And maybe. But anyway, although the title of this panel is, I think, something like Defending Just War Theory, I take it that actually what I want to do is not so much defend just war theory, which after all may change and adjust itself, has changed and adjusted itself over the centuries, but simply defend just war. That at any rate is what I'm going to try to do. And defending it as a Christian means understanding it as a way of enacting love for one's neighbors and obedience to God. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to be said about that than I'm going to be able to say now. But for the moment, I'm just going to content myself with 4 short points. The first of them is on a sort of a different track. It's more kind of procedural, the spirit in which one ought to think about such things. The other 3 are more specifically about the substance of the matter itself. But let me talk first just a bit about the spirit of the matter. If you think about just war, you're likely to think about Matthew chapter 5 pretty quickly. And Jesus tells us in Matthew 5 not to strike back at someone who has struck us. That's important. It's also important that in the same chapter, Jesus says that the commandment against killing goes deeper than we sometimes think. We're not to be angry with the brother. We're not even to insult the brother. So that it's not just killing that Jesus wants to stop, it's hating. That'll send you to hell. So then, we have to wonder what's going on if we find ourselves or see someone else whose hostility toward war leads to hostility toward those who defend it. We may not have gotten to the deepest problem at that point. And I'm going to take the risk of giving you an example of that and making just a brief comment on it. I want to read you the first 2 paragraphs of a little piece titled The Sin of Smugness that appeared not too long ago in the Christian Century. Here's how it went. I never expected First Things to give a theologically nuanced interpretation of the current U.S. war on terrorism, and it hasn't disappointed me. Its editor-in-chief, Father Richard Newhouse, has yet to see a war for which he could not provide theological justification from the magnificent Catholic magisterium, despite what the Pope says. Yet I have been astounded by the relentless unanimous smugness that has characterized First Things since September 11th. Everyone who writes for the Journal is so sure that we are right, so certain of President Bush's sagacity, so damnably smug. Though Jesus didn't condemn smugness as a sin, he should have. Now think about it for a moment. Not all of you may sort of have the background to realize this, but I would be the last to deny that Father Newhouse has a polemical gift, which he puts to very frequent use, and sometimes perhaps even misuses in various ways. I have myself on a couple occasions in the past written him privately to tell him I thought he'd misused it in one way or another in connection with someone. And in fact, I believe the author of The Sin of Smugness has a time or two been on the receiving end of that gift. But then, that said, especially in a context where we're thinking about war, where therefore Matthew chapter 5 might naturally come to our mind, where we would be all too keenly aware that we are forbidden to retaliate, the author retaliates. So it's okay to hate as long as the weapon you wield is only the pen. Then, too, there's just the tiniest whiff of anti-Catholicism in that dig at the magnificent magisterium. Now, I'm no defender of the magisterium. I'll leave that to Professor Toner. I'm a Lutheran. We have our long-standing disagreements. But again, this is where a certain kind of spirit leads.
We love you anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. And then, too, it's not just Father Newhouse who is so damnably smug and warmongering. It's the whole magazine. It's everyone who writes for the Journal. Even it appears, at least taken literally, if they've never written a word in it about war or the war on terrorism. That, you see, is where hatred leads. Not to a controlled and limited response to what you take to be wrong, but just to verbal violence. Actually, I think Jesus did condemn this smugness. I think he condemned it right there in Matthew chapter 5. And if we're going to think about war and think theologically, we need to remember that there is a sense, I understand that our culture doesn't think this way, but that the deepest problem is not killing, it's hating. And we need to keep that in mind. That said, let me make three other short points more about warfare itself. The first, just a little bit about how we should talk about it, if we're not just to talk past each other or yell at each other or something like that. War is not violence. We need to say that and keep that in mind and keep that clear in our language. Let me cite an authority whom I came across in my research. When a few years ago a brawl had broken out in an NBA game after an episode of trash talking, Hakeem Olajuwon was quoted in the paper as follows: "Fines or suspensions for 1 or 2 games won't solve the problem. You have to work to establish a professional code of conduct. When you get into calling names and trying to embarrass opponents after a play, it shows your insecurity. I understand promoting the flashy plays, sports is entertainment, but violence and taunting are not entertainment. A warrior fights an honorable fight and does what he can to win. You don't do things that can end a career or humiliate people." You have to root for a man who's capable of a comment like that, I think. But my point is that just as trash talking is not fighting to win a basketball game, so also violence is not war. If we claim to be talking about war, but use the language of violence, then we just won't get anywhere. We'll just talk past each other. The word violence suggests a kind of purposeless, spasmodic, and uncontrolled wreaking of havoc. And that, of course, sometimes happens in the midst of war, and we can even understand how soldiers may do it, given the pressures that they're under. But when it does happen, it's not an act of war, because war is the limited, controlled, and purposeful use of force to serve very important human goods of justice, freedom, and peace. Next point. We need to acknowledge that war brings out some of the worst in human beings. As Simone Weil writes of the temptations of the warriors in Homer's Iliad, she says that every morning the soul castrates itself of aspiration. That is, given the kind of pressure under which they live, the seeming hopelessness of it, facing death daily, one may finally just give in to the pure momentum of violence. Not wage war any longer, but just give in to that. And we have to grant that that happens. At the same time, we can't say that without also granting that it is a fact that war brings out some of what is most noble in human beings. As Weil also writes, there are in the Iliad what she calls those luminous moments of courage and love. And through it, she says, an extraordinary sense of equity breathes throughout the Iliad. So both of these things are true about warfare. We can't settle the question of the rightness of warfare by pointing to all the evils it brings in its wake, though we have to think about them and take them into account when we make our judgments. We can't settle it either by setting over against those evils the extraordinary acts of nobility that war sometimes also brings in its wake. If we're going to settle the question, it'll have to be on other grounds. And that brings me then to my last point, a more strictly theological point. It is the loving God, the Father of Jesus Christ, who establishes government for our good. It is from the example of God's own ordinance, therefore, that we may see how love may take the seemingly strange shape of discipline, punishment, force, even warfare. Through such means, God protects neighbors in need and protects those important human goods of justice, freedom, and peace. Now, God does not, at least ordinarily, do this through some miraculous intervention. God doesn't just zap the bad guys. That's not how it happens. No, God cares for you through me, for me through someone else, and for you and for someone else through you. It's a gift exchange. No one paddles his own boat. Each paddles another. And in this way, God works justice through our hands, not by some miraculous zapping, but through us, even through our very forceful hands. I was in my accustomed evening spot on the couch just a little more than a week ago, watching the White Sox play the Kansas City Royals, when an event happened that some of you may well have seen. Indeed, if you watch the news and are non-comatose, you've probably seen it, because it made it not just onto the sports news, but sort of all over the news. Two shirtless fans, a father and a son, as it happens, inexplicably ran onto the field and began attacking from behind a guy named Tom Gamboa, the Royals' first base coach. All honor to the Royals bench, and especially to Nefi Perez, who was first off the bench to jump the attackers. Very little honor to the first base umpire, whom the replays very clearly showed time and again standing there and just watching the attack happen. Jesus says that I should not resist the one who does evil to me. I should not lift up my angry hand in retaliation against the one who does me wrong, because if I do that, I'm likely to do it in hate, not in love. That's really the reason. That's exactly right. I shouldn't do that. You should resist him for me, for my sake and on my behalf. And if you do not, you tempt me to do what I ought not. You tempt me to doubt that God really cares and provides for me, for God wills to do it through you. Thank you.
Our third speaker this afternoon is Professor Russell Hittinger. Russell Hittinger is the Warren Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Tulsa, where he also serves as a research professor in the School of Law. Specializing in issues of theology and law, since August of this year he is chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. He was a research scholar at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research in Washington, D.C. from 1991 to 1996, where he worked on issues of law and religion. During that same time, he was also associate professor in the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America, where he taught philosophy and philosophy of law. Dr. Hittinger has taught at Princeton and Fordham and NYU. He's published with the University of Notre Dame Press and Oxford University Press. His articles have appeared in the Review of Metaphysics, the Review of Politics, and International Philosophical Quarterly, and several law journals. He's on the editorial boards of First Things and the American Journal of Jurisprudence. Professor Hittinger.
I come neither to praise just war theory or to condemn pacifism, and I should say briefly with respect to pacifism, an Orthodox Roman Catholic cannot condemn pacifism out of hand, since every cleric under tonsure, every member of the clerks regular in monastic communities since the late 5th century are under a norm of not responding to unjust force with any form of violence. Within the Benedictine tradition alone, this includes something like 3 million men and women since the late 5th century who would be pacifists in this sense. What I want to call attention to and to criticize briefly is a very bad amalgamation of just war theory and pacifism, which I believe has become the standard version of just war theory today. After World War II, statesmen and theologians and churchmen made just war abide a new consideration, which was not originally an organic part of just war ethic. Namely, what Catholic theologians today call the presumption in favor of peace. This presumption is evident not only in the Catholic world, from Rome to the U.S. bishops to the Society of Jesus, the only thing all three of those could ever agree upon. But it's certainly evident in the 1945 United Nations Charter, Article 2, Section 4, which appears to prohibit transboundary, offensive, preemptive, preventative, unilateral uses of war, no matter what the justice of the cause, and notwithstanding official declarations of war. Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter appears to rule out not only first use of war, but any second use of war that is not purely defensive, that is, being used against aggression presently taking place. 2 weeks ago, the Weston Jesuit School of Theology issued a declaration affirming the strong moral presumption against war, calling upon the USA to recognize the limits and principles of international law, urging cooperation with the United Nations, and castigating any unilateral or preemptive use of force. It's not an unusual statement. I take this to be the default position both of the United Nations and the Catholic Church, it seems to me today. One understands and appreciates the high-minded sentiments expressed, but I want to point out that the strong moral presumption against war, coupled with the United Nations stricture against offensive and preemptive use of war, no matter what the justice of the cause, coupled with the existence of powerfully armed states which have no intention today of declaring war. No state has declared war since Russia declared war on Japan in the spring of 1945. Coupled, once again, with the multilateral norm, has the unintended effect of opening rather than narrowing the floodgates of armed force. And so my paper should be entitled Just War Theory in Disarray. I'm not sure anything remains of the ad bellum criteria of just war anymore. So let me begin. I have to make my points quickly. Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter rules out the threat or use of transboundary military force against the territorial integrity of a state, against its political independence, and in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Article 51, however, recognizes an inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if armed attack occurs. These two articles were meant to limit the recourse to force only to self-defense. Self-defense against an attack presently taking place. But let us notice what Article 2, Section 4 does not address. It does not address responses to terrorism, drug cartels, piracy, where there's no question of sovereignty or territorial integrity. In fact, armed force could be used against pirates, drug cartels, and terrorists precisely for the sake of territorial integrity and political independence. Nor does Article 2, Section 4 address the situation that happened in Kosovo, where NATO bombing was not directed at taking away territory or sovereignty. Nor does it address the issue of civil war, which I believe is going to be the end game of these Middle Eastern countries from Egypt to Iran. But the purposes, not inconsistent with the United Nations, then include Article 1, promoting and encouraging respect for human rights. So Articles 1 and 2 of the United Nations Charter seem to underwrite such things as the intervention in Somalia, humanitarian interventions of an indefinite and unspecified sort. If Article 2 leaves ajar the door to armed conflict, Articles 39 to 51 seem to positively open more doors to armed conflict. Article 39 allows the Security Council to determine the existence of any threat to the peace, breach of the peace, act of aggression, and to decide what measures shall be taken to maintain or restore international peace and security. Article 41 restates the presumption against war, but then says the Security Council has authority to give effect to its decisions by nonviolent means, such as interruption of economic or diplomatic relations, including blockades, which were always regarded as a cause of war. I mean, blockades are a quintessential instance of an act of war. Here they're called acts of peace. Presumption against war. The very next article, 42, empowers the Security Council to override that presumption. It can take, quote, such action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. And Article 48 permits the Security Council to give executive force to its decisions either by all of the members of the UN or some of them, as the Security Council may determine. Security Council has an indefinite ground for declaring war and can outsource it to who it pleases. Now, the problem should be clear. Without any declaration on the part of states involved, the Security Council can authorize armed force beyond the limits suggested by Article 2. In fact, not declaring war seems to be the very point of the system envisaged by the United Nations. Articles 39 to 51 permit force to be projected across national boundaries without the consent of the country or the people immediately affected. This is basically multilateral unilateralism. We are no longer entitled to speak of the causes of war. Rather, we must speak of the causes of overriding the presumption in favor of peace. Apparently, the Security Council is not bound by the stricture against first use of force, including preemptive use of force. And the causes which permit overriding the presumption in favor of peace are legion. Repelling attacks against sovereign states, intervening to stop grave violations of human rights, such as ethnic massacres, which the local government cannot or will not remedy, interpositioning of troops to create buffers between belligerents, enforcing UN sanctions, and generally intervening to uphold Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, which is respect for human rights. The consequences is that traditional limits on the causes of war are in tatters from this doctrine. Transboundary and preemptive uses of military, which are arguably within the confines of a traditional cause of war, allowable, now are indistinguishable from preventative uses of war. That is what our current administration calls regime change. This can be authorized internationally merely by the vote or lack of veto of the 5 nations of the Security Council: China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and USA. Since these nations are no longer divided along Cold War blocks, such permission is easier to obtain than a declaration of war by the Congress of the United States. Anyone who thinks that UN multilateralism is putting institutional or moral checks on the use of force is not looking at this carefully. If the Security Council of the United Nations may authorize military and economic blockades, deputize some or all of its members to deploy armed forces, intercept pirates, drug cartels, terrorists, rogue nations who commit grave violations of human rights, or ordinary nations unable to remedy such violations within their territory, if the Security Council may act preemptively and preventatively to stop accumulation of weapons, mass destruction, to restore national territories taken by an aggressor state, why can't the United States? And I don't see any principled reason why it cannot. Now, we noticed that the resolution that President Bush sent to Congress last week to empower him to enforce peace. In the entire resolution sent to Congress, the entire thing was justified on Article 51 of the UN Charter, and I should point out that the word war is never mentioned in this resolution. The word just is used once. In the companion document released to the press last week called the Bush Doctrine of International and National Security. Not that this is ultimately dispositive of why just war ad bellum part of just war is in tatters. The word peace is mentioned 26 times. The word security, 16. The word war, 8 times, 7 of them metaphorical. War of ideas, so on and so on and so forth. The word war is only mentioned once in that 30-page Bush Doctrine paper. Concretely, it's almost as though someone missed the boat and referred to the war in Afghanistan. The word justice is used twice, but in neither case in relation to war. Right. So what we have in the case of the Bush Doctrine is a rather bellicose and utopian statement of the ideals of the commercial republic, fully prepared to take advantage of Articles 39 to 51 of the UN Charter, to have an indefinite source of the causes of war, including things never permitted by the old just war theory, which is regime change for the sake of mere prevention. Finally, I should say, this amalgamation of pacifism, which is a burlesque of real pacifism, with just war theory, predicated on this presumption in favor of peace, which then we're dared to override, is just, on moral grounds, terrible doctrine. I mean, I'm not attributing motives to anyone who's, but just objective. It's a terrible moral doctrine. Notice that the old just war theory never says the norms of justice can be overridden. But the new just war theory, which is just peace theory, I suppose, challenges nations to override the presumption. The easiest thing to override in human history is a presumption in favor of peace. Indeed, if there's ever a strong reason to override a norm or a presumption, it's for real or perceived threats to one's life and limb and property. I believe this beclouds traditional just war ethic, and it beclouds Christian pacifism. And indeed, I think the language of pacifism has been co-opted, and it is liable to have unintended and very severe intents, consequences by giving us an unlimited set of causes of war for the time being. Thank you.
Our panelists will now take questions and comments. I'd ask you please to raise your hand, and I'll recognize you, and then please stand for the benefit of the whole room so that they can hear you too. Go ahead.
For Dr. Hittinger, I wonder if you care to comment on the bishop's pronouncements and letter to President Bush and their stance against the justification of war in Iraq.
Could you please stand too? Thanks.
I haven't read the document. I've read the Western document. I read the Roman document. It came out, about 3 days ago. So, does it include the phrase presumption in favor of peace? Do you remember?
No, I don't.
Okay. Because this kind of issue about intervention in Iraq could be argued from either point of view. I mean, in fact, the argument, it could come down to simply matters of fact, right, about the imminence of the threat, so on and so on and so forth. But I would rather reach the right conclusion without having to override what seems to be the principle of your theory. I mean, to reach a correct conclusion in the practical order, which overrides the presumption of the entire inquiry, seems to me to be a very heavy price to pay, even if you happen to arrive at the right answer.
Yes, right here. On the main aisle, yes, you.
Okay, this isn't directed to anyone in particular. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. More of a practical application rather than a theory, but the regular citizen in America, how are we supposed to make a rational decision about just war with the secrecy or possibly ulterior motives of the Pentagon or the executive administration, especially concerning just cause, but also proportionality in the war?
Well, I'll say a word about that. You should start by not being quite as skeptical as you are. The best of governments that had no ulterior motives would still inevitably have information that made judgments of proportionality easier for people in certain responsible positions than for the rest of us. I mean, that's inherent in the nature of the system, and I don't think there's any reason to kind of wring one's hands about that, or kind of feel that it creates an insuperable problem. Just that with respect to proportionality. Just cause is, I think, an easier, I mean, not easy at all, but somewhat easier for the ordinary citizen to think about, even without access to all sorts of information. I mean, certain things do, at least traditionally, qualify as just cause, and one can at least, form one's own judgment about whether they seem to fit in this case or not. So that in the Iraq case, if that's the one you're talking about, I mean, obviously unless you buy the kind of mid-20th century narrowing of just cause only to defense against aggression, which I don't, which I think is wrong, then I would be willing to think about the claim that a threat is so imminent that preemption is necessary. I myself think that case has been made right now, just judging as best I can, and they don't invite me to the Pentagon to see the information. But it seems to me that ordinary citizens can at least think that one through and make some attempt at judging it. With respect to proportionality, it's much harder to have all the information, and at least when you live in a nation the size of this one, I'm not inclined to blame anyone for the fact that I can't get that information. In fact, I wouldn't want them to give it to me. I'd vote them out of office the next time if they tried to give it to me.
Baxter.
Neil, I'd like to follow up on this, what you just said. Let's say, for example, in the situation in Iraq, that the case isn't made, or that people, average citizens and church members, find that the case has not been made. What would that scenario look like for the case to not be made over, say, the next 3 or 4 months? And then, what should Christians do about that if it's not? And in particular, I refer to Christian soldiers.
I always tell my students that the penalty for answering one question is that I ask them another one.
I suppose we could open up to the other two things.
I might add that I don't actually think it's going to play out that way at all. I think it's going to play out with the insertion of inspectors with the implied threat of force if they don't carry through, and that so it'll be a different scenario. But on the hypothesis you propose, the first thing I want to say is that I admit that I think of just war theory I think of the use of just war theory in a rather different way than some people do. I think of it as primarily advanced instruction, giving us categories to teach us how to think about something, not categories for holding people responsible after the fact, though once in a while that has to be done and one doesn't. So that I think that if a soldier were absolutely persuaded that he or she were being asked to fight in a war that was unjust, well, then he'd have to decline to do that and take whatever penalties came with it. The justice of going to war, though, is always, a whole range of issues are involved, and whether you think that single one of those criteria is determinative or not, might or might not be true. But if one were really in conscience persuaded that that was the case, then you shouldn't do what you take to be wrong. I think it's harder. If I were a soldier, I would be much more reluctant to arrive at a judgment about just cause, say whether the case had been made for a preemptive strike, because I would be much more reluctant to arrive at that than I would to arrive at a judgment that I shouldn't shoot that surrendered soldier or unarmed civilian if I were ordered to. I mean, because the clarity and the amount of information, the kind of information you need is not the same. But if in conscience one really thinks that, well, then some things follow from it.
Professor Toner?
Let me respond to that, because that touches me where I live, because I teach not only at the Air Force Academy but at the U.S. Air War College. And I deal with lieutenant colonels and colonels who have strafed and bombed and killed people, and who are deeply bothered by that from time to time, as they should be. So these questions for them are not academic, they're not a priori, they're questions of everyday life. And because they are, with very few exceptions, good and decent people, and I hope many of you, most of you, all of you would stipulate that, they are bothered by these questions. The teaching of the U.S. Armed Forces on this issue is very clear. And it's clear not only from a natural law perspective, if you will, but from a positive law perspective. If I, as an active duty U.S. Air Force officer, receive an order that I think is morally wrong, I must disobey that order. More to the point, I must report my superior officer to the appropriate authorities for giving me an order that is morally, on a prima facie basis, irregular or wrong or illegal or immoral. That's all to the good for the American Armed Forces, by the way, because not every armed force subscribes to that. There is a phrase in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I could give you a 2-hour lecture. I promise you I will not. It says that a person of ordinary sense and understanding, if a person of ordinary sense and understanding receives an order that he or she believes to be wrong, immoral, unlawful, that person must disobey that order. To answer your question specifically, Father, from the Catholic tradition, Acts 5:29 says we must obey God before men. It seems to me that is fundamental to our character and constitution as Christians, as Judeo-Christians, in fact. Yes, Father?
Can I say one more word on my answer? And then just adding on the tricky thing with what you're asking about a soldier disobeying because he thinks there's not just cause is that unlike the case of jus in bello, say where you're ordered to kill an unarmed person, in this decision, it's just always harder to distinguish it from political disobedience, from political disagreement. That's what makes it hard. That's all.
For example,
Can we get Professor Hittinger's?
No, if you can
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Michael respond.
It seems to me that it does pertain, particularly to Professor Toner's remark about Elizabeth Anscombe, for example, being his hero, because in 1939 she did say that for England to go to war against Nazi Germany would be immoral. And she said so on the basis that documentary evidence indicated that the British and other Allied forces were ready to use obliteration bombing to win the war.
Well, we all know that heroes can occasionally be mistaken.
Well, I mean, the point is, I think perhaps she wasn't mistaken when the pamphlet was withdrawn on the Lord of the Bishops. Yet, my point would be to Dr. Toner, if the UCMJ does say that soldiers are obligated, officers are obligated not to perform immoral orders, what evidence do we have, say, in the so-called Good War, World War II, that they did that in the obliteration bombing campaigns of Germany and Japan, or in the case of the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima?
Can I respond? I don't think this is a forum for us to debate at length the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I would recommend to you and everyone a book by Richard B. Frank, F-A-R-N-K, called Downfall. Have you had a chance to read that? It's an excellent book and probably a definitive scholarship about the USA bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I recommend it. Richard Frank's Downfall. The fundamental teaching of the armed forces, which is in line with Christian doctrine, is that when soldiers receive orders that are immoral, they have no option except to disobey them. But that is not to say that that rubric is perfectly followed. Simply because there are the pressures of the battlefield, there's the pressure of moral cowardice, there's the pressure of peer concerns, and so on. So we're talking about an ideal that says that any time that one's conscience conflicts with an order, one must follow his conscience. And we wouldn't disagree with that as Catholics, and we wouldn't disagree with it as warriors.
Yes, I think the in bello considerations, to my mind, are clearer for a Catholic where disobedience comes. I think the concrete problem for Catholics today is, just as I say, an unlimited set of reasons for using military force, which can no longer be called war, coupled with the fact that in the United States we're the last nation left with the will, so long as public opinion prevails in this direction, and the hardware to do it. So by joining the armed forces, which I believe to be a noble profession, and I believe killing in a just war is blameless myself. You sign up for the armed forces, you're signing up to do all kinds of different operations now, which can move from police action in Kosovo to regime-changed type of operations in Iraq. And by the way, after this, there's going to be civil wars in this region. It's unthinkable that there are not going to be civil wars in the Muslim world, because their populations are not happy campers either. Intervening in civil wars, chasing terrorists, and the only thing that sustains this is international law permits you to do it, and we have the hardware. So if you have a scrupulous conscience that there's a real difference between preemption and prevention, as just war theorists and as statesmen used to have, you have no guarantee when you're on the C-130 going over which one you're going to be doing. I mean, that could be beginning to be a ground for this. The only limit I see on it right now in terms of cause of war is public opinion.
Thank you. Professor Hauerwas.
I was interested that you didn't appeal to Luther in response to my question, because Luther says you cannot know, if you even suspect that the prince's war is unjust, you are still to follow the orders of the prince, because the moral blame is on the prince's conscience, not on yours, as a soldier. And I raise that partly to say that one of the problems when you start talking about just wars in these abstract manners is politics that is informing them. And part of the politics that is informing contemporary just war is democratic presumptions that we are all citizens, and therefore we are operating with the same kind of consent. John Rawls says the laws of people. We should all act and try to imagine that we are Secretary of State, trying to decide what is the best for the best possible foreign policy under the laws of justice. But that very presumption then creates the idea that if I am a soldier, if I am a citizen, I am giving my willing consent to whatever is going on, because this is democracy. Then the question is then how in the hell do you ever get a contrary voice? I mean, if Christians started off saying, hey, I'm not a citizen of the United States, I am a citizen of God's kingdom, which means, as a matter of fact, my first stance is not to say, okay, I have an obligation toward the state, but rather toward the church. Then, as a matter of fact, you might be producing people who might know how to say no. When did Christians ever in America know how to say no?
I'm sorry. Go ahead. You didn't really think I was going to appeal to Luther.
That's a selection. You appealed to him earlier in the board.
No. I appealed to something that it's true that Luther holds, though quite a few other people hold too. There was nothing sort of peculiarly Luther about that. I actually don't suppose that Luther is a guide to a great deal of political wisdom. I don't actually think very many Germans are guides to that. And if you have a name like Mylander, you can say that. But I don't particularly think Rawls is either. And my original answer to the young man there suggested a rather different notion than the one you just depicted as Rawls of what it means to be a citizen. I wouldn't want to say, though, that you put it characteristically, if I may say, as that we are only citizens of God's kingdom. I think there's a dual...
I didn't use the word only. I didn't feel.
Well, we're not taping the session, Stan, so I don't know. But I thought you did, and it seems to me that it's never that easy. There's always a kind of an intricate simultaneity going on. We do belong to. We have a dual kind of citizenship. There's no question about what the fundamental loyalty is. That's true, but that doesn't mean that you don't have obligations as a citizen of that society, and somehow one has to seek ways to manage both of those.
But my question comes right out of what Russ is trying to drive on, and that is, what must the church look like in order to form people capable of having just war habits so that they can actually be of service to a wider order that isn't necessarily just war. I mean, just war people have got to start talking about formation.
Actually, there is so much talk about formation going on in Christian circles these days that my own inclination is to think we should take a vow not to talk about it for a year. I mean, vocation, formation, it's coming out our ears. Every Christian college in the country is trying to get a grant from the Lilly Endowment to have a program on it. I mean, I don't know what the answer to your question is, Stan, what the church should look like. I mean, I don't think I'm capable of answering that. But the notion that we're going to somehow arrive at a point when here we've got the church able to form exactly the right kind of citizens, I don't expect. I think we struggle on doing the best we can.
Professor Toner and then Professor Hittinger.
Actually, I'm surprised, Professor Howard, to hear you say the comment that you did say. Maybe I misunderstood you. I should say, by the way, I'm Irish Catholic. I'm not about to appeal to Luther. But it does seem to me that the concept of respondeat superior, which used to be taught, that is to say, let the superior respond. It was taught until Nuremberg, Tokyo, and Manoa in 1945 and 46. That if I'm in the military services and I get an order, if it's an grossly immoral or illegal order, I am to do that, and then my superior will respond. Clearly, that's contrary to Christian conscience. It's also contrary to positive international law since Tokyo, Nuremberg, and Manoa. I must disobey an order that I know to be immoral. That having been said, the question then resides in the minds and hearts and consciences of parents and clergy and all concerned people to educate that conscience. That may not be the function of the military, although it must provide the opportunity for it. It is, in fact, the responsibility of all of us here. But respondeat superior, that is to say that I'm not responsible, my superiors are, doesn't wash, and it's a good thing that it doesn't.
One of the problems is, I think that's very clear in jus in bello considerations, that your superior orders you to directly attack a village and kill civilians, to harass the guerrillas or whatever. That is much clearer. But how about going to war? It looks to me as though, and I say this cautiously because I can't read everyone's intention, but the Catholic Church today is saying, if you got the agreement of the UN, it's okay. Isn't that what is being said? I mean, if you have a congressional resolution, all the better. Now, that surely is not traditional just war theory. And it makes the moral bench for this indistinguishable from the politics of the Security Council and public opinion. And this was never intended by Vittoria and our great jurisprudence. I mean, I don't see an independent voice on the ad bellum. In bello, I'm in complete agreement that you can teach you can form the conscience to see direct attack of civilians, shooting disarmed prisoners. Well, these things are wrong, and you have to disobey orders to do it. But the going to war is the crucial one, is it not? I mean, that tells you whether or not, justice first has to be there before it can be anywhere else.
Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm just struck by the confusion, both in culture as well as the Christian community, that's unable to distinguish between the criminal and the punitive act. And it seems to me there seems to be an ideological predisposition against the response to the criminal act. Those of us who have done public policy work, for example, see there are parallels between criminal justice and just war implementation of just war thinking. And that is, there's difficulty among some, even many religiously informed, to distinguish between the criminal and the punitive act. So it seems to me the question is whether, in fact, justice can be meted out through the earthly authorities, and we may have different understandings of statecraft in this area.
Any comments from a panelist on that? Okay. Yes, in the blue shirt in the back.
Andrew Lynn, Dayton University. I was very fascinated by Professor Hittinger's comments about this particular sort of morass about just war theory. But doesn't the technology that has arisen in the 20th century in warfare create another type of problem for just war theory? The dilution of the ability to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. When I think about the possibility of what might happen if we would have a military intervention in Iraq, of all the different scenarios which would result in enormous loss of human life, both in the Middle East and in the United States, really tied with all kinds of accidental connections. How is a individual soldier or leader deciding to send troops into action to really be able to assess what is likely to be the non-combatant deaths as a result of a military action?
I know Professor Toner wants to take a crack at that.
Well, yeah.
Just off the top of my head, the very areas that the UN Charter puts the least limits on, piracy, drug cartels, terrorists, etc., rogues of various kinds, are precisely the areas where it is most difficult to distinguish in trying to suppress them between the innocent and the not innocent. That's where the UN puts the fewest protections. So, this is not just the fault of the military. This is the fault of the statescraft, the very way we're envisioning these. Once you have a rogue nation, all applications of Article 2, the presumption for peace of the UN Charter, are out the window. So, once you get something in the category of rogue, what follows from that in terms of our traditional rigorous distinctions between combatants, non-combatants, officials, civilians, seem to evaporate. And, that alone, it seems to me, should lead to more caution rather than taking advantage of the legal loophole that the UN provides.
Okay. Other comments? Yes, sir.
Here's an argument I was just thinking of in favor of thinking there is a strong duty for the individual soldier to discern whether the cause for going to war was just. It is wrong to kill innocent people. Therefore, we have to have a presumption when we go to war that the people on the other side are not innocent. The soldiers on the other side whose deaths we intend. I think the only way we can have that presumption is that there's a strong duty for somebody to discern the causes of war. Namely, what are they guilty of? They're guilty of having failed to discern that their side's cause is unjust. I don't see what else they could be guilty of. And if that is what they're guilty of, then likewise our side, the soldiers on our side, in order to be just, must put good effort into making that discernment. It would make it easier if one has certain presumptions about a government that is in general just or something like that, but it doesn't. But we can just leave it at that.
But Vittoria addresses that issue. It's always been a problem once you start thinking about just war, which is the moral culpability of the other side. And Vittoria explicitly said it's easy to imagine a situation in which both sides subjectively believe that they are not culpable, but in fact on the right side. But you have to imagine one side as being very badly ignorant. But it would seem to me that this happens all the time in warfare, that it's very difficult to judge the subjective culpability of the other side. Republican Guard in Iraq, I have no idea what's going through their mind. So the judgment has to be not just to the culpability, but to the objective acts they're committing. I mean, from a certain objective point of view. I mean, they may think they are right. That's the judgment that you have to presuppose, is that the acts they're performing are objectively
I
wrong.
would assume that we presume that if they're committing these bad acts, they are culpable. I mean, otherwise we would not be able to move against them.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not sure the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, every person in the Viet Cong was subjectively culpable. I mean, even though they murdered thousands of villagers and so on and so forth. I'm not sure that's so.
We have time for one more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Edward Furton from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Question for Dr. Mylander. You had said that it's not war that's the problem, it's hatred that's the problem. And I'm reminded of a quote from Thomas Aquinas' treatise on charity, but I wonder whether it's not at the heart of the whole just war theory in some sense. It's a really striking phrase. He says that hatred of what is evil is equivalent to love of what is good. And I take it to mean that we have a moral duty to hate things which are evil, such as rape and murder, violence, and that those who are indifferent toward these things are acting in an improper manner.
Yes, although using the language of hatred there in a way somewhat different, I think, from the way I was using it. So that if one wanted to use the language the way I was using it, one wouldn't say hatred of what is evil, but opposition to what is evil, something like that. I mean, that's required of Christians. Whether hatred is required of Christians depends on the way I was talking about it. I was talking about it as a kind of motive that would always be forbidden to Christians. So, I mean, to some extent, we'd have to sort of sort out the linguistic issues there, I believe.
Great, thank you. It is 2:45 and the end of this session. I want to thank our panelists and thank all of you.